get this underway. And if people want, if Richard is going to be joining us or others are going to be joining us, um, we can we can get started. So let's begin with prayer. Gracious God, we come with a lot of questions. We are in process of learning what it is to be part of the United Church of Canada, or if anything, a reminder of what that is. My prayer tonight is that we would have a spirit of learning, of being willing to ask questions and to contemplate contemplate the answers, as there are some that are simply stating history, but also just how we wrestle with certain issues. And so we would pray that you would guide us with your Holy Spirit, surround us with your love and peace, we pray. Be with us in the questions that we ask, in the answers that we wrestle with, and the questions that continue to be raised. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. All right. So tonight, I don't have as much just raw material to go through by comparison to any of the previous sessions. I have, of course, provided slides just for points of talking. But this is also an opportunity that I kind of regard this as almost a stump the minister night. Um, I mean, there is some material that I am going to be covering, but there's also a lot of room, and I've made space for a lot of questions. So if there's anything that we haven't covered that you want to ask a question about, we can most certainly do that. Um, and just with where we're at, this is today is week 4, and it's the and it probably is the most open-ended of all the nights that we have, and it may lead to, we might, if we feel that there's an additional sessions needed, we might pick this up and say, okay, we're going to just deal with this particular question on that night, but we might be able to cover some of it today. Um, and hopefully go from there. And again, just my boilerplate um, uh, recap is just as a reminder that a good resource to work with is this book here, this United Church of ours. It is now only available in digital format. There is not a print version of it through Woodlake Books. If you'd like a direction of it, now I happen to have a digital copy here as well, but it's something you can either read on your computer or if on a tablet, if you like. But unfortunately, Woodlake Books has stopped their printing businesses and is in digital only format these days. But of course, the one caveat with this particular book is that it was published in 2017, right as the United Church of Canada was implementing an entirely new governance system. So it's almost it was out of date as its publication. But in terms of understanding its ethos and understanding of the United Church, it's still valid, and is definitely worth talking about. Um, and of course, just a reminder of where we've come from. And one of the things that we're going to be talking about here is just in terms of some of the numbers that you see here, in terms of where things were like in 2021. That there are particular decisions and stances that the United Church have taken that some have argued has accelerated the decline of the church. And one of the pieces, now I don't necessarily have the numbers, but that I'm going to present is that is actually not true. Um, uh, is the church in decline? Yes, every major denomination and across the board is in decline in North America. Uh, Now, is the Christian church in decline around the world? No, it still remains the largest and fastest growing faith group in the world. Uh, but it just right now we're in this ebb of um, faith expression. Sorry, I have to put a phone aside because my son is now getting calls through it, and I need to put it face down and away so it's not buzzing on my desk and making noise for that. Um, so anyway, the what I wanted to do with go through in terms of part of it, what do we believe, and one of the features of the United Church of Canada, this is again stuff that we've come through, is that how the United Church of Canada came together is in terms of three three different denominations, or effectively denominations, with two major theological outlooks that came together, and which has been both it has been both a boon and a bane, in terms of that. One of the things that I was reading earlier today is that, Gary, I think this actually speaks to your question, is that people moving to Canada, the if they come with a faith tradition, quite often they're looking for the faith tradition that they came from. So, for example, if you're Presbyterian, you will look for Presbyterians. If you're Reformed, you'll look for Reformed. If you're Methodist, ideally you come looking for Methodist, and you're kind of going, well, where are the Methodists? I don't know if that was your experience, Gary, when you first came here, or how that's been.
Yeah.
So so because of that, there is a certain drawback when it comes to people emigrating to Canada, is that there's lack of familiarity of something that's familiar to them, and it's not necessarily something that we've been very good at about working with immigrant communities. Now, that said, there are, for example, various ethnic congregations within the United Church of Canada, and also, like, interestingly enough, we actually had yesterday. Was it yesterday? We had somebody. Yeah, it was yesterday. Somebody came into the church who is a minister with a Korean congregation looking to do a church plant and needing a modest sized facility to get that started. And so we exchanged information, because having another church meeting in our building on Sunday afternoons, and particularly in this case it would be a Korean congregation, is certainly an option. Anyway, so just as a bit of going through that, as I've just been kind of showing these slides as we going through, a reminder that the United Church of Canada used to be a 4-council system that had both elements of Presbyterian and Methodist organization, with a kind of almost like a salting of Congregationalist mixed in with it. Now we are a 3-council system that also has encouraged, but thanks to COVID, unfortunately, that likes to encourage informal networks in the areas between region and community of faith. So that's one thing that we're trying to work on. I mean, our experience of our shared worship service at Brecken on November 5th, for example, is an example of that kind of local regional cooperation that we are encouraged to work with. But it's still it's still an informal kind of thing. Um, and also just here's what that breakdown of what the various regions look like, representing 16 regions, overseeing 2,000 communities of faith. Now, some of those communities of faith are 2-point charges. So there's roughly in the neighborhood of about 2,600 congregations in the United Church of Canada, uh, give or take. I mean, and the so the so the 2,000, like, so there's 2,600 congregations, but grouped into 2,000 communities of faith across the country. Ours happens to be the largest, but only by two. The second largest is Saskatchewan at Living Skies, and the smallest one is unsurprisingly Quebec. And one of the things in terms of saying, okay, great, this information is all great, but the question is, as Trinity is part of the United Church of Canada, what is it looking, in terms of looking forward? And some of this is to cover some of the things that we've done. Is that one of the strengths of the United Church of Canada is we work with and celebrate diversity. And now some might argue just excuse me for a second. Some might argue that we're really loosey goosey on our theology, that we don't really know what we believe. And is that fair? I would say probably not. Have I the but at the same time, there certainly have been some controversies that have cropped up, and we can talk about some of those tonight as we go forward. But one of the major features that kind of just reflecting back is that the United Church is a product of the Third Great Awakening that started in the middle of the 19th century and basically came and that Great Awakening sort of culminated in between 1925 and 1930. And one of the major features of that Great Awakening, and this is both U.S. and Canada, is the concept of the social gospel, of responsibility, of taking on that responsibility for the poor, advocating for various for human rights. And so it was kind of a mix of the gospel combined with the age of enlightenment in terms of the assertion of the individual. But the idea is that our responsibilities to society is a reflection and our faith in action. And the idea of cooperating together in that is very much a part of that. And so if anything, the United Church of Canada has continued to carry the torch of that Third Great Awakening forward as much as it is able to. And if you look at our history, that's more or less where that's at. And so we tend to be about diversity and welcome, tend to be given more weight than any than doctrinal assertions, and it has put us at odds with other facets of Christianity. I remember back when I was a Presbyterian student, attending a Presbyterian General Assembly, and I was a student from the Vancouver School of Theology, studying with United Church students and Anglicans. And I found that when I went to the General Assembly that I attended happened to be at Knox College in Toronto. Um, and so I got a chance to experience a whole bunch of Knox students at this. And what I found is because they had not been in close proximity to United Church or Anglican, that they had this particular lens that they were looking at other denominations with, specifically the United Church, that that weren't accurate. Going so far as to actually calling the United Church a post-Christian church, and my experience was that no, that's not the case at all. And it was sort of one of those seeds that eventually saw me move. It was one of those seeds that was part of the conversation that saw me move from the Presbyterian to the United Church of Canada.
Excuse me, but I thought you said the Presbyterian also joined the United Church of Canada.
Yes, they did, but not all of them did.
Oh.
The Presbyterian Church in Canada still exists, and they are the remnants of those those Presbyterians who did not join the United Church of Canada. So there is, for example, one Presbyterian as in Presbyterian Church in Canada, church here in Nanaimo, and that's St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, which is just off of Departure Bay Road starts, just behind
Brooks Landing.
Pardon me, Betty?
Brooks Landing.
Brooks Landing, thank you. And
up by Best Buy.
Yeah, it's sort of like just it's in behind Best Buy, and Jeremy Bellsmith is the minister there. I mean, because of my former tribe, I'm still very much in conversation with them. But they were depending on how you calculate it, and I mean, a couple sessions ago, I brought when I was talking about the origins of the United Church of Canada, is that it was about 2/3 of the Presbyterian Church in Canada joined the United Church, but that was in terms of raw membership. It was about 92% of the congregations joined the United Church, but in terms of its membership, even within specific individual congregations, there were splits where people joined the United Church and others that actually broke off and formed their own continuing Presbyterians, or if the congregation as a whole elected to remain outside of church union, that there were those in those churches that decided we want to do church union and formed their own. So you can actually, you see this more in Ontario, that you can actually drive into a town in Ontario, and on one corner there is a United Church, and right across the street there's a Presbyterian church. Sometimes they even have the same name, and the buildings are identical. And that a lot of that had to do with the with that. Now, curiously enough, the Anglican Church of Canada, the United Church of Canada, and the Presbyterian Church of Canada in Canada, that was one of the big sticking points, is that word "in" versus "of." Have now, they're all selling their respective the buildings in headquarter buildings or national office buildings, and all moving into one building. Now, here we are 100 years later, and the cooperation between the denominations is quite good. So,
where is that building?
I don't know it's in Toronto. I can't remember the precise address.
That's okay. I'll say I was just wondering which district.
Yeah, Toronto.
Mm-hmm.
Like as we would say, Gary, I don't know what your experience is that Toronto is sometimes in Canada referred to as the center of the universe.
Yeah.
Because generally, if you're in the Toronto area, your mindfulness of anywhere else in Canada, it often kind of fades into the background, just simply because the greater Toronto area is just so large. In fact, it boasts a highway through it that is busier than anything in Los Angeles. So, it's not bigger than, well, I don't know if it's any bigger than, anyway, that's another point. But anyway, now you have 100 years later, these denominations working more closely together, but the concept of doing organic union isn't really that sort of chapter within the United Church or within Canada kind of closed around the early to mid 70s. And we're actually going to kind of get there. So a couple of things that set the United Church have set things is that the United Church of Canada ordained had its first ordination of a woman in 1936. And it wouldn't be till 1966 that the Presbyterian Church in Canada caught up to that. And I think it was even later with the Anglicans. It's certainly Church of England. It was actually early 90s when that happened. So it's not been recent. But interestingly enough, and Gary, this is more to you, is that in the United States, however, the Methodist Church has been ordaining women since the 1880s, I believe. Certainly for a long term. If now I could stand corrected, but I believe that was the case. So that sort of ethos was there. But Lydia Gruchy went to a Presbyterian seminary pre-Church Union in Saskatoon, what eventually became a United Church seminary, and had been working extensively and kept applying for ordination because she had completed all the work, and was repeatedly denied because I think she graduated like 1924 or something like that. And it was and eventually it was the Saskatchewan Conference said, you know what, we're just going to ordain her and just go ahead, and even if it puts us at odds with the national church. And then the national church actually made a vote. Do you support the ordination of women? And it was overwhelmingly approved in 1936, which is very, very forward looking. In the 1940s, even though it was a popular thing, is the internment of Japanese Canadians during the Second World War, and particularly, of course, being here on the coast, a number of those Japanese immigrant communities, many of them who had grown up like were second, third, fourth generation Japanese, were basically rounded up and shipped inland and put in camps. And I believe the same thing happened in the United States as well.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and the United Church spoke against it, even though that move, at least amongst Canadians, was considered to be a popular move. And of course, we've and again being ahead of the curve, that now the historical assessment was that was a really bad idea. And also, oddly enough, they were in cooperation with other churches in that dialogue. They started talking to other churches, be it Anglican and Presbyterian, even though there was still some rivalry that would continue. That they were one of the founding bodies of the Canadian Council of Churches, and in 1944, and the World Council of Churches in 1946. Cooperation, we want to cooperate ecumenically was very much their idea. So also, interestingly enough, there was also the questions about the residential school system. The United Church in 1925 had effectively inherited responsibility for 12 what were then called Indian residential schools that was a part of the Canadian program. And Gary, I'm not sure, this is a bit of a, I'm just going to go into a bit of a background, that there was a policy established not long after Canada was founded. Was the idea is that to effectively a program of cultural assimilation of people of indigenous people. And they were basically required to send their kids to these schools away from their homes, and churches gladly ran them on behalf of the government. And unfortunately, they were places in which there was a great deal of abuse happened in these places. And it, you know, we're like, I'll eventually get to this later, but we are because this is actually part of more of the current conversation. But as early as the 1940s, the United Church of Canada was thinking, you know, this isn't such a good idea. And so they started quietly closing those schools. Eventually, like originally, they had taken on responsibility for 12 at Church Union, because those were already Methodist, Presbyterian, Congregationalists that just fell under their purview. They took on the operation of additional 3 during that time. But by 1940, there was questioning as to whether or not this was a good idea. So 1949, they started closing them. But that process of closing or the becoming no longer part of that would take another 20 years.
Why did it take so long?
Partly because that the questioning of it, there wasn't a sudden turn. It was a slow process of thinking that this was not such a good idea, because there were sections of the church that were very much in favor of it and continued to be. And it really wasn't until the and some of it, they were kind of bound into contracts and things like that. But at the same time, we know that, I mean, is there, you know, even in the 60s, there were many that was very much embraced. But it was a slow turning over 20 years of closing that. Marilyn, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I read someplace where a minister in Ontario worked with the natives, and he was working with the chief, and they worked very well together, and thought that everything was going well until the government got in, saying that we, you know, influencing them, that they it had to be governed by the government.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, keep in mind, this was the churches were administering it, but they were under very specific guidelines under the Indian Act. As it was called. And so it became of, you know, what is it that we are doing here, and the slow realization that we are doing harm, because there were places like there were some, and I'm not saying residential schools, but there were some positive partnerships. Like, for example, there were positive partnerships with First Nation organization. Morley, Alberta, for example, had that, but then there was also a residential school at the same time, and so like it was conflicted. It was kind of like, well, this is positive, but there's something wrong here, and it took time. Now the other thing is that of course in 1950 the United Church championed universal health care when it was not popular. Tommy Douglas, the founder of who is largely credited as creating the universal healthcare system in Canada, was himself clergy. Not, I don't think he was. I don't think he was United Church, but it was certainly, it was something that the United Church did support when that came forward. The other thing is in during the Vietnam War, there were many draft dodgers that moved north of the border, and the United Church actively supported that. Not a and that was not a popular thing, even in Canada. And then, of course, in 1969, the last residential school closed, which happened to be Port Alberni, close by. Was the last of the residential schools closed. And now, the reason that I put a star there is that the residential school closed in 1969. The United Church was largely done with it, but the building itself continued to house students for another 4 years until 1973. But in that intervening period between 69 and 73, when it was closed for good, the government administered it, and the United Church had no responsibility at that point. However, some of the most severe abuse that happened at that residential school happened between 1962 and 1968. So that's something to keep in mind. Is just because they were slowly, it doesn't mean that there wasn't abuse happening. On a more positive note, in 1971, the hymn book, which I think we still have a few copies of it, choir members, like this is the red one that had musical staffs in the shape of a cross. Sometimes we just simply refer to it as the red book, even though our newer hymn book is also red, but I'm sure most of you, if you were with the United Church, probably remember it, because it was in place from 1971 until 1996 when Voices United came out, which I'll be mentioning that again. But it was a joint venture between Anglican Disciples of Christ and the United Church of Canada, created in the anticipation that the Disciples of Christ, the United Church of Canada, and the Anglican Church of Canada would further form a further union. There was conversations and talks about merging the denominations even further, but for various reasons, the United Church itself was all for it, but neither the Anglicans nor the Disciples of Christ thought. Eventually they pulled out of it, and by 1974, 1975, that prospect was gone. It was done. But one of the efforts of moving towards that was the creation of this cooperative hymn book in 1971, and this hymn book would remain in place. Probably from 1971 until 1996 is when it was in use within the United Church of Canada. At some point, there was a publication of a supplement called Songs for a Gospel People, which, little bit of trivia here. Our office administrator, Morgan Luna Rose, her grandfather was the editor and compiler of Songs for a Gospel People. So, and it was a small green coil book. And eventually what happened is, when Voices United was created, is a lot of the songs that were in Songs for a Gospel People were folded in with a lot of the songs from the 1971 hymn book, updated, and then turned into what we now know as Voices United. So we actually have some living history with that particular book and hymnody in our congregation now. So this is stuff of people we know.
And Klusmeyer would have been in them all too.
Oh yeah, you know, sort of Ron Klusmeyer, a lot of his material is both in Songs for Gospel People and the Ron wasn't on the scene early enough to have any of his hymns really included in the 71 book.
Mm.
But I do remember my dad teaching a choir to sing some of Klusmeyer's pieces in the mid-70s. For example, the Praise to the Lord, that's a song from my childhood that I remember that Ron wrote. Gary, just to give you an idea, the Ron Klusmeyer is he's actually originally from Minnesota, but he's lived in Canada for a good chunk of his life, and he's a known musician and composer, but he also happens to do an event at our church twice a month called Praying Twice. And so a lot of in fact he's there tomorrow. And I know that Joy, you're gonna be there. You're gonna be there too.
Oh yes, I'll be there to make coffee.
Yep. And and we host people coming in to sing with him. But yeah,
So that's the gentleman that does the videos during worship, the music.
Yes.
Videos?
A lot of the videos that we have come from him. Well, he happens to live here on Vancouver Island, and have made an arrangement that he comes and does these sessions on the second and fourth Wednesdays of the month. He's currently working with an Anglican church up in Qualicum Beach, because that's where they live. That's where they live now. But you know, so it's a case of that connection directly to some of these hymn books that we're talking about now are actually active people that you can actually meet here, and which is kind of fun.
Yeah.
So now the other thing is the United Church has also been quite progressive in terms of its social outlook. In 1980, now keep in mind this is 1980, they put out a report on sexual ethics that indicating that there shouldn't be anything against homosexuality. That even the stance on marriage and divorce was quite revolutionary at the time, and that eventually led to what is referred to as the 1988 decision. The trouble is the 1988 decision overshadowed a whole bunch of things that actually happened in 1988 at the General Council in Victoria. So again, local. In that sense, but the General Council being the meeting of the entire church from coast to coast, and so in 1988, the United Church made a number of very important decisions and statements that continue to have an impact today, that continue to have an impact. One of them was there was a vote. And it was passed that the United Church decided to divest itself with any investment in South Africa in opposition to apartheid. That was one. And of course, you're all going, well, that's, you know, like, don't worry, I'll get to the big one in a bit. It also was the year that there was the first apology to First Nations for past denials of native spirituality. So not necessarily an apology with regard to the residential schools, but certainly the first apology for past denials of native spirituality. In other words, saying we were wrong to basically effectively label your spirituality as satanic, because at some point, if you looked at some of that wording that happened in decades previous, that's often how it was perceived. And that was when that first apology came in 1988. It also saw the first moderator of Asian descent, the Reverend Sang Choo Lee, But it also, of course, was the adoption of the statement of membership, ministry, and human sexuality, which ultimately what it meant is it answered the question of, does one's sexual orientation prevent one from being a full member of the United Church of Canada? And if you can be a full member of the United Church of Canada, that means you are eligible for ordination. And so this became when the United Church of Canada, if effectively stated that your sexual orientation is not a barrier to ordination. If you feel if you feel called to ministry within the United Church of Canada, and the church recognizes that call, then you are eligible. Your orientation should not matter. That happened in 1988. Now that had fallout. It had particular fallout with Trinity. Now, were any of you here at Trinity in 1988 when that happened? Okay, so all of you have come to Trinity since then. My understanding, please correct me if I'm wrong. I think Heather Wills was here, and Trinity was representative of a much more conservative viewpoint within the United Church of Canada, and I think it was almost 2/3 of the congregation left. It devastated the congregation, because at one point, when Trinity, when Trinity originally formed, it was actually a merger of a United Church, what was United Church in the Wellington area, as well as a church in Lancel. They came together and built a space to share with the Roman Catholic Church in what we called the Nanaimo Ecumenical Center, which is just up the road from us, Holy Trinity Catholic Church. And for many, many years, from 1977 through to 2021,
Yeah.
we shared that space. But one of the things that altered that fairly drastically, of course, in 1988, is that when that first formed, Trinity was the much larger congregation and the Roman Catholic Church was the junior partner. But they went in agreeing, saying, we're going to split the costs of this 50-50. Well, over time, the size shifted and changed. Holy Trinity, or Trinity Catholic Church, now Holy Trinity Catholic Church, began to grow and benefiting a lot from immigration from countries where Roman Catholicism was fairly strong. Eventually ended up in a position where we were probably 1/5 the size of the active congregation at Trinity, and yet we were still splitting the cost 50-50, and it wasn't something we could afford. So we ended up selling our stake in the building, moving to where we are now. But in 1988, my understanding is that there was like 2/3 left, I think, including the minister, if I remember right. At the time. So it was pretty devastating. But interestingly enough, across the board in the United Church of Canada, even though like conservatives groups sort of pointing and saying, hey, look, the United Church is declining. But if you actually look at the overall statistics from 1966, from when the United Church started registering a decline downwards, there wasn't a drop off. It was actually just it didn't improve things, but it certainly didn't make anything worse. Put it that way. The demographic decline did continue, but it wasn't as catastrophic as people claimed it to be. The United Church of Canada, in the approximately 4 years after 1988, lost about 78,000 members. But the reality it had lost about that many members in the years leading up to it, and it's just been kind of that same thing.
Were there congregations, entire congregations that left the church then? Were there votes to stay in the denomination as a church?
No.
Uh, well,
Or-
here is the short answer is sort of. In the United Church of Canada, all church property belongs to the national church. So if a congregation decided we are going to leave, the United Church said, well, find another building. And so effectively that's what happened with Trinity is that the group left and bought their own building and formed themselves as something else, which whatever that congregation was existed for a time and then petered out. I don't think it still exists.
Yeah.
Um, and
Sorry,
so
sorry. So did you say the 2/3 that left Trinity because they wanted to go with the idea of sexual orientation was, so that 2/3 left,
mm,
but they didn't join any of the other United churches that agreed with it?
no. Well, no. Like 2/3 of Trinity left because they did not agree with the decision in 1988. So they went and formed basically an independent Congregationalist church.
Oh, Congregationalists. Oh.
Yeah. But from what I understand, that congregation, I don't think it still exists from as far as I'm aware. And I mean, I don't like, I have to double check with Heather knows the story more directly than I do, but it was a case of it kind of went, and some eventually trickled back and some went one of the things that I do know, coming from the Presbyterian end of things, is that a whole bunch of, especially here on the island, is that congregations that saw people lose members, though they went to the Presbyterians.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, what they did is when they went to the Presbyterians, they brought all their baggage with them. And there became, particularly here on the island, as I learned when I was doing my internship, is the idea is that if the United Church of Canada is doing it, we should not. That was their entire mode of being. If the United Church of Canada is doing it, we should not be doing it. And so, for example, in the early 90s, there was movement within the Anglicans, Presbyterians, and United churches, at least, of revising their hymn books, of putting out a new hymn book. So the United Church was doing it, the Anglicans were doing it, and the Presbyterians were doing it. But when I did my internship at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church in downtown Victoria, I was at a session meeting where, I mean, word for word, so this is something I personally experienced, is that one of the elders who got up, and as I discovered, is that he was an elder, but I mean, this was 1994. And he had been part of a United Church before that, so he came over and suddenly got into leadership in the Presbyterian Church, and he got up and said, we should not, the United Church is also doing their hymn book, we should not be doing that. And it didn't help that my father was actually on the hymn book committee for the Presbyterian Church in Canada. So because the thing is, I personally know these people. And like, that's my dad. And actually one of the other people who was actually on the hymn book committee was Morgan's grandfather. Because not only did he put together Songs for Gospel People, but he was one of the major consultants for working with, and he was because he was a professor at Vancouver School of Theology and a noted church historian and musician. He was actually on the hymn book committees for the Anglicans, the United, and the Presbyterians, all of them. And so, like I said, we actually have some living history with us. Gerald is now living in Kelowna, but he's the same. If my dad were still alive, they'd be the same age. He'd be the same age as my dad. He was born in 1940. Go ahead, Gary.
On the big split was, as it is in many congregations, is the question about ordination of gay people. What is the stance of the Presbyterian Church in Canada on that issue today?
Today, it's not a barrier at all. In fact, finally, some people that I like my first summer field placement was at Centennial Presbyterian Church in Calgary, and the guy that I worked with, he was a few years older than me, fairly freshly ordained, and the thing is, I knew he was gay right from the get-go, and he was finally able to come out of the closet and serve in a Presbyterian church, but he was raised in one of the most conservative areas of Ontario, in and around, I don't know how well you know where Peterborough is, but he was raised, but he was able to, he came out of the closet, and he's now married, and he's the happiest I've ever seen him. But it was a case of, he felt he had to suppress that part of who he was, for many years. And I mean, the thing is, theologically, he was like a lot more conservative than I was, in how he expressed himself, in that point. But now the it was, it was about 5 years ago. No, not even that. Like between 4 and 5 years ago, that that changed amongst the Presbyterian. I mean, I had already moved over to the United Church of Canada at that point in time, but yes, in terms of where they are now, sexual orientation is not a barrier to ordination. But boy, did it create some fights in the meantime.
Yeah.
Probably, I would say much more vitriolic fights amongst the Presbyterians, in that sense. Also, you'll notice here is that in the 90s, really, that's when the United Church started to come to terms more with the legacy of the residential schools. I mean, we're still dealing with that. We are still dealing with that today. But you got to see things like the first Indigenous moderator of the United Church of Canada, the Reverend Stan McKay. Of course, just recently, the Reverend Dr. Carmen Lansdowne, who is the first female Indigenous moderator of the United Church of Canada. Began her term last year. But in 1994, there was the establishment of a healing fund for residential school survivors. This was even before things were before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That sentiment, that idea, Cheryl, going back to what you had said, is that from fairly early on, the United Church said, this is a bad idea, and then eventually getting out of it. But it still took, from 1969, when the last residential school closed, to the 90s, like 30 years later, where an actual apology happened. It still took a long time.
So is this healing fund, so each one of the churches gave a certain percentage, or?
I think it was established at the national level that people could contribute to. I brought it up on the if you go to the United Church's the United Church's page, I mean, I can give you the link, and it provides a link on the Internet Archive of what it was at that point in time when it was first established. But it wasn't so much that congregations themselves were tithed; it was something that the National Church set up, that was set up out of either what they received from congregations through the Mission and Service Fund, or any sort of the national funding measures that they had, or that people could contribute to directly.
Yeah,
that's how it was set up. Of course, sort of in the middle of this, as I mentioned before, Voices United was published. Curiously enough, 300,000 copies printed by 2010. And then in 1998, so 29 years after the closing of the last residential school, is this apology to the residential school survivors. And I mean, this was something that came, that there was, of course, there was that original apology in 1998, to just simply saying, you know, we were bad to, you know, to dismiss your expressions of spirituality. And many said, well, that was sufficient. That's all we need to apologize for. And it was actually on a visit that moderator Bill Phipps to Port Alberni was that realized that no, we actually need to apologize specifically for our involvement in the residential school system, and that happened in 1998. In 2005, the United Church of Canada urged the Canadian Parliament to pass same-sex marriage legislation, which did happen in and around that time. Also agreed to in 2005, but signed on to it in 2006, of the Agreement in Principle for a Comprehensive Resolution Package for former students, survivors of the residential schools. And in 2012, First Nation congregations were invited as signatories to the Basis of Union, recognizing that many First Nations congregations were part of Church Union in 1925, but at that time they weren't given a seat at the table. And that is, and of course, during this time between 2007 and 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada is going on. This was a formal, Gary, this was a formal program that the government of Canada had set up as a part of our legal process. Has something called a commission. Can be a commission or inquiry, that you have independent judicial oversight of a particular exploring a particular issue, and to basically review the government's conduct, and in this case it went a step further to let people who were in the residential school systems to be able to tell their stories. And that happened between 2007 and 2014, with the report being issued in 2015. The United Church of Canada maintained a listening presence on that, and they actually have a statement of we've sought to implement. There were 94 recommendations or calls to action in this. 14 of them directed directly at the participating churches. So, and in this case, it was Presbyterian, Anglican, United Church, Roman Catholic for sure. I can't remember if there were necessarily any others. But this is something that, as the United Church of Canada, we are there is a formal statement on how we have responded and how we would like to how we are continuing to respond to particularly these calls to action that specifically single out churches in that point of time. And again, it's been this shift over a shift in attitude over a long period of time.
I don't.
Go ahead.
I don't understand the 2012 one.
The 2012 one? Okay. Well, do you remember when we did the evolution of the crest?
Yes.
Or were you there for that session? Okay.
Yeah.
2012 is when the crest changed from being a solid blue background to the colors of Medicine Wheel. And what it was is that there were in Church Union, at the beginning of Church Union, there were several congregations that were primarily or entirely Indigenous First Nations, and some of them were Congregationalists, some of them were Methodists, some of them were Presbyterian. I mean, I think of, for example, the one in Morley, Alberta, where there had been a fairly healthy relationship, but because they were sort of generally affiliated with these other ones, but they were somewhat independent, but they were just kind of absorbed into it through the United Church of Canada Act. and not really given that they had the choice to do so. And so effectively what this did in 2012 was recognizing they were already there, and part of this reconciliation is to recognize their presence from the get-go.
From the beginning.
From the beginning. And
Oh.
so it effectively it was kind of retconning our retcon is a geek term. I don't, are you, any of you familiar with what that means? Okay. It's actually something that has emerged from comics, that when you have a whole bunch of convoluted storylines, how do you maintain continuity? And so they called it retroactive continuity, retcon. And it you know, and effectively that's, you know, it's acknowledging that it didn't happen then, but it should have, and we're recognizing something that did exist at the time. So it wasn't necessarily rewriting history; it was just acknowledging a historical element that was already there. And so hence why that ended up. Now, this is the last slide that I have tonight, only insofar as just going through the various notable stances and events. But I know this probably won't have answered, if there's any burning questions that you have. I'm happy to throw it open, and I've got some web pages in the background, and hopefully I'm well armed. But if there's anything else that you wanted to know, because for example, I'm not sure, did we bring up in one of the previous things talking about, like, for example, sacraments in the United Church of Canada?
Yeah.
No,
We did cover
Yeah,
that?
talked about the two sacraments.
Yeah, as opposed to in Roman Catholic circles, that there's 7. Now, at one point, I could rattle off what those 7 were, and if Richard were here, he'd be able to help me. You know, because you have baptism and communion, but in addition to that, in Roman Catholic circles, you have confession, what is referred to as extreme unction or last rites, holy orders, which is ordination. Marriage is actually is a sacrament.
Yeah.
And it's the last one that I'm forgetting. And
First communion, will that be one?
well, that kind of falls under communion.
That'd be part of, yeah.
It could actually be the consecration of a bishop, but I can go look it up. So it's like, okay, did I? And so I find myself second guessing. Did I cover that, or is there anything else that I'm kind of missing? And
your funeral? Your funeral?
A funeral? I don't think a funeral is necessarily a sacrament. I mean, here's a little interesting point, is that even though professionally I do funerals, and I do weddings, I have a license to do weddings that is granted to me by the government, where I'm acting as an agent of the state, that the denomination has basically said, yes, this person has fulfilled the requirements in order to have that. Such a license does not exist for someone to do a funeral. So in other words, all of you could actually do a funeral tomorrow if someone asked you to do it.
I did it for my mom.
Yep. There is no requirement, no professional certification that one has in order to lead a funeral service. Now, you do have to have professional certification to be a funeral director, or because there are like there are a number of things in terms of both physical and legal things that you have to cover while doing that. But that's an example where something that is often perceived as being the exclusive territory of clergy is not. You know, and I mean, I find it interesting, like one of the reasons why Protestant churches sort of strip things back to just the 2 sacraments is part of it's the biblical warrant. But there were certain things, like in the early church, marriage was something that, like, for example, the apostle, like Paul, was actually quite ambivalent about marriage. He said, well, get married if you have to, but you don't have to. You know,
Well, I heard that there were the two that most Protestant churches had, the baptism and communion.
Yep.
Are the two that Jesus experienced in his life, the only two. He wasn't married and he never died, really. So
right, you know, and so like and I suppose his version of last rites was Lazarus. So I'm not exactly sure if that was,
yeah.
you know, sort of the right thing. Betty.
Yeah, so the one you missed, I think, is confirmation.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, confirmation is a sacrament in the Roman Catholic Church. So that was the where my pinky was flapping.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead, Marilyn.
Okay, we have the head of our United Church now is as native.
Mhm.
Where are these churches? Like, we haven't got have we got a church in Nanaimo that is a native United Church?
Not in Nanaimo. There is
On the island?
yes. So, like, for example, in Port Alberni, there is a United Church community that is associated with, but separate from, the Alberni Valley United Church. So there is, Morley, Alberta, for example, also has a indigenous congregation. There's several in and through Winnipeg. There are several throughout BC as well, but often they are located on what we would at one point
Native.
What we used to call reserve land. So there, there aren't necessarily a lot of them. I mean, I can again, that's one thing that I can look up. But at the same time, there is also within the United Church of Canada several communities that have where there is a very active ministry within various First Nations communities, and like Vancouver School of Theology has had an Indigenous Ministries program for a long time. Like, it existed when I was there. And so and it existed for United Presbyterian Anglican as well. So is multi-denominational. And so you know, these were people I went to school with.
So in the Residential United Churches of Canada, considering that in, forget what year, one of the ones that you mentioned, that the United Church of Canada apologized and said that they should not have negated the first Indigenous spiritual items.
Yeah,
if you went to a present church in a residential, like on native land,
yeah,
would there be a mixture of the two?
Yeah, like you might
be a mixture of both.
You might experience a mixture of things that would be considered to be more local traditions. I mean, one of Christianity's strengths was its ability to integrate itself into the culture. It wasn't really until the rise of colonialism where you had this imposition of additional culture onto it. Like, of course, we brought European culture to North America, whereas in its earliest forms, Christianity more or less kind of slid in under the radar and began to integrate with existing spiritual traditions. For example, Christmas trees.
Mhm.
You know, Christmas trees are a German pagan, you know, local tradition that now it seems that, you know, if you're seen as anti-Christian if you don't put up a Christmas tree. You know, so what essentially has happened is an allowment, you know, allowing certain aspects of First Nation spirituality. And the trouble is, it's also very specific. Like the certain spiritual practices in, for example, on the West Coast, amongst the Coast Salish people, are different than they might be for, you know, amongst Cree or Huron or Mohawks, Six Nations in Ontario. There are different local practices. Now there has been, because a lot of that culture was in danger of being lost, there's been some cross fertilization.
Mhm.
I had the opportunity to, but I didn't get a chance to go to a sweat lodge when I was at Vancouver School of Theology. That would led by one of my fellow students. Unfortunately, the day that I was supposed to go, I came down with a nasty norovirus, and I don't think it would have been. I couldn't even get out of bed. Never mind to the car. And so that was for me, that was one of my big regrets of not having a chance to experience what that was. But given my state of illness, that probably was not going to be a good idea if I did. And I've not had the opportunity to do that since. Just to simply to experience it. Amongst the Presbyterians, for example, the Presbyterians in and around the Vancouver area, there's something called Hummingbird Ministries, which and then there's also in Winnipeg as well, that what they're doing is they're exploring ways of exploring the Indigenous spirituality as expressed through the incarnational story of Christianity. And what we're finding is in that sense is that when Christianity is allowed to become integrated into rather than imposed upon,
Yeah,
it works better.
absolutely.
You know, although some would say, well, you know, you're watering it down. It's kind of like, well, no, it's a matter of carrying that message of Emmanuel, of God with us.
Mhm.
You know, and God is most certainly capable of working within any expression in that sense. But it's been something that has, you know, like kind of shedding that idea over that we've kind of brought with us, and like all of us were you know, we're largely raised in that kind of environment. That, you know, it doesn't negate, like one of the things, as I said earlier, that the United Church is sort of accused of being a post-Christian church, and yet ironically is that the churches that are trying to do that are saying, well, you know, you don't take the Bible literally, and you got to take the Bible literally if you're a real Christian. It's kind of like, no. The only universal agreed upon statement in terms of what Christianity is the Nicene Creed. If you're within that parameter, you're in. And ironically,
what are these Christian groups called that want to do it strictly by word?
Well, I mean, I think it depends. Like we usually use the term fundamentalist, but that's sort of broad, like broadly speaking. I think we perhaps have had different experiences of them. There's certainly a couple of denominations that I could probably name off the top of my head. I in fairness, I won't. But we may have run into them. I mean, like Gary, for you coming, like Missouri is noted to be fairly conservative theologically. Am I correct? Just on a whole.
Yeah, I mean, it's, it's conservative in all regards, I think, as a region, as a state.
Yeah.
The urban areas are more liberal and progressive.
Yeah.
But yeah, as long Cheryl had mentioned, I was kind of thinking about the same thing about the idea of when you read the Bible, and I enjoy reading the Bible, and I'm still involved in my Saturday morning Bible study, even though it starts 2 hours earlier than it did before I left. But whenever I hear somebody that has a very strong opinion about what a particular scripture reading means or what implications, I'm always very suspicious of that person and thinking about, well, is that really the Spirit of God? And then, when you start looking into it, people like you that study these things in seminaries, will tell you what it means in Greek and what it means in Hebrew and Aramaic and everything else. And, it comes down to me just thinking about, God is really love, and all people should be included in that worship experience. And so, yeah, I mean, I've been going to different congregations here since I moved 2 months today, actually.
Wow.
I've been in Nanaimo, and I try to find out about what their beliefs are. Some of them by reading on websites, and some think like marriage is between a man and a woman.
Yeah.
So, forget about, it's not really accepted, anything outside of that. I'm not talking about necessarily even ordination of clergy. I mean, just the fact that the institution of marriage.
Yeah.
So, and the reason they say that isn't because they're mean or hateful people. They'll cite St. Paul, who said marriage is between a man and a woman, or whoever. They'll quote you as scripture. But you can kind of use scriptures to justify any of your beliefs. So it's very confusing to a guy like me.
Yeah.
Trying to fit in and finding a place that is a welcoming community that I feel good about being involved in, but also I can live with their theology.
Yeah. And I mean, I think I've really appreciated your perspective of that, because one of the dangers of us being in our own separate denominations is we're in our own bubble, and are you familiar with the term confirmation bias?
Yes.
Okay, so you do any of you, Cheryl, are you familiar with what confirmation bias means?
I assume it means that whatever you were confirmed in, that's what you want to stick with?
No, confirmation bias means that we tend to seek out things that confirm what we already believe.
Oh, sure, yeah.
That's what confirmation bias means. So in other words, and the thing is, the reality is, it's human nature. We all do it, and saying, oh no, I don't do that. The reality is, and it's a matter of just kind of pausing for a second, trying to catch ourselves in the midst of that, and it requires a certain degree of critical thinking. But at the same time, we also need to be honest with ourselves in terms of what is that we believe and understand about ourselves, about what do we believe about God. And the diversity of the United Church of Canada allows a wide range, and of course, and I'm thinking I'm also thinking in terms of, I mean, we have Greta Vosper in the United Church of Canada. Although that's just an interesting thing. If you want me to talk about that, I can. where there is room for a diversity of belief. But generally, the United Church of Canada, it takes the like broadly speaking, is that love, diversity, and inclusion is how we reflect God to the world. God in Christ.
See, and that's what the United Church is. But like some of those churches, like the Evangelicals or the Baptists, I mean, they're just, I can't go there. I mean, yes, I was raised that way, but I can't go there. I have too many, I don't fit in with what they believe.
Yeah.
I mean, the thou shalt not do whatever. I mean, there was just no way.
Yeah. And that imposition, like the imposition, and again, it's one of these things where you know, but the United Church of Canada in various places did, and I'm not sure if it still does, but in the church, for example, that my father grew up in, it was very, very much part of the Cape Breton culture. Like if you didn't show up at church, the tongue started flapping, you know, and the last thing that you wanted to be in Cape Breton culture was talked about. And there's a reason that my dad moved away from Nova Scotia. Lovely people, but it was you know, one of the things that it seemed that when people got up in the morning, the first decision on their mind is, what will the neighbors think? And all of their decisions, from what I wear at church to where I sit at church to what I hang on the clothesline, is dependent upon what other people will think. You know, for example, my grandmother had a rack for all her private underwear that was never hung on the outside line because of that. Has nothing to do with it has nothing to do with faith. It's, what will the neighbors think?
The neighbors will think that she doesn't wear underwear.
Yeah. So the yeah. But
well, I have a question. I don't think this is a question about the United Church of Canada, or if it's just a phenomenon I've noticed here in Nanaimo, but I've been to the three United churches in town. I haven't been to Cedar yet, but I did go to the the joint meeting at Brecken a couple of weeks ago. So I guess, and I've been to St. Andrews a couple of times. So I guess I've been to 4 or 5 worship services in the United Church, and I think the young man that we just saw show up on the screen, Ian.
Yes,
I think he's the only kid I've ever seen.
Yeah.
I mean, where are the children? Where are the young families?
Well, yeah, and one thing that Tiff McNaughton, the minister at Brecon, when she did note something that we've been somewhat aware of for the past number of years, is Nanaimo itself is like Canada as a whole is less religious than the United States, just across the board. And then in Canada, British Columbia is less religious as a whole than the rest of Canada. And apparently, Nanaimo, of all the communities across Canada, is the least religious community in Canada. Like apparently 62% of the folks here do not have any affiliation with churches at all. And a lot of them skew young. Now, that's not to say that there aren't churches that have children. Like I'm told, for example, of Departure Bay Baptist Church apparently does.
I went to First Baptist Sunday, and there was probably 60 kids there.
Yeah,
and even St. Andrew's Presbyterian had,
Yeah.
a few, you know,
Yep.
some.
Yep.
Um,
And in our case, like you know, Ian of course is regular because I'm there. We do like at Trinity, we probably all the United Churches in town. We probably have the most children sort of in an orbit around us, but I think it depends. Like for example, we're doing a family friendly shared thing on Friday night, Messy Church. Um, uh, and we've been rotating between like we did it last Trinity in September. We hosted it at Trinity, and then this Friday it'll be down at St. Andrews, and that's where you start to see some of the kids. But usually it's a case of grandkids. We do have you know, we do have some families with children, but in some cases the children are grown. I mean, you know, my daughter's at university, but she also experienced the negative side of churches when she was growing up. My brother, who's a year younger than I am, does not attend church, and I'm a minister. He had a very negative experience of church. Oddly enough, not in the denomination that we're part of, but amongst the more conservative denominations in Calgary. That he had a number of friends who said, "Hey, come here," and he came away terrified of those experiences. But do I have necessarily a coherent answer? It's hard to say. Like for example, at Ian's bus stop, there are a couple. There's several families there. They all know what I do. And in Cubs, everybody knows what I do, and all of them feel that they can approach me to ask questions about spirituality and faith. But the practice of actually attending church on Sunday morning is just not something they were raised with. Like we have two possibly three full generations of people who were just not raised that way, and it isn't as high a priority. And not necessarily excusing it, but I mean that's kind of where
yeah.
we've ended up.
But it doesn't bode well for the future of the church, you know, if that's a norm.
No,
Um,
and I
yeah.
mean what tends to happen in the mainline denominations is that there is some degree of contact, but what we have been getting is people who have at one point and they're returning to faith. That's where we now it you know, in terms of just population growth and the like for example, both John Helps and Tiff McNaughton themselves did not grow up in the church, and now they're ministers in the United Church of Canada. Um, uh, Sarah and I were raised within, you know, I was, well, like I said, I was wherever the gig was, so I had a multi-denominational experience myself, and because Dad was a church organist, I didn't have a choice. But when I became a teen, when David and I hit our teens, they did give us a choice, and I continue. And for a while, I drifted away. But the reason that I came back to, like, I consider myself as a comeback too, is that you're gonna laugh at this. I was in the music program at the University of Calgary, wanting to be a music teacher, and was realizing that I needed some work on practicing singing because that was part of the program, and I didn't really have a good way to do that. But my dad was the choir director at the church, and I said, Dad, do you mind if I join the choir? You know, with the intending to do it to boost my music grade. That was it. And look at where it got me. And so we can never tell necessarily where God is calling us, but it's basically providing those opportunities. And so what I think we're tending to see with the United Church is people who have had a chance to go out and experience life. Like I would venture to say that probably half of the United Church ministers on Vancouver Island came to faith as adults, not as children.
The,
It-
the other thing about where are the children, where are their parents?
Yes.
Because,
Well, yeah.
like, our church are all old people like me.
Mhm.
And our youngest people are probably 60.
Yeah,
Well,
that's what I've noticed. I mean,
Mhm.
there's a lot of gray in the pews.
There,
Oh, lots of it.
there is.
Yeah.
Now, it, you know, some of it is that, like that said, Vancouver Island does have a higher proportion of people of
Yeah.
retirement age and older because, well, Vancouver Island is sort of kind of like Canada's version of Florida,
Mhm.
because the winters here are milder and what have you. So there is a higher proportion of that. But now that said, in the time that I have moved here, there have been more young families moving into the area than before I came. Like, at virtually, like there are two bus stops that I often take Ian to, and I've been here for 3 years, and virtually everybody at those bus stops has moved to Nanaimo since I came. And so some of it is like trying to reestablish that kind of connection. And for us, you know, you know, as I said, my parents were very active in church. I happen to be. My brother is not. And in terms of talking about I think one of a challenging issue is not only are the young children, but the adult children of our members are ones that don't attend as well. Would I be correct on that?
My adult children do not attend any church.
Neither do mine.
Yeah.
No, my son goes to a Lutheran church because that's the choices in the town are either evangelical or Lutheran, and his wife was raised Lutheran, so they go to the Lutheran church.
Yeah.
My daughter, on the other hand, there's an Anglican church on Saturna, but they don't attend. When they're here, I mean, they come to church if they're here. We say grace. That's just something that they're accustomed to because that's what we do.
Oh,
I know my brothers only go Easter and Christmas. They you know.
Yeah, and the thing is, this wasn't to put you on the spot, but the thing is, this is something that's almost across the board. Where, I mean, of all of my friends, many of them weren't even raised in a church environment, so they don't go, and it's and they don't even know to go. And on the other hand, the others, because of various things and you know, this disaffection with organized religion, that we tend to see this moving away. Like in the first session, I talk about these sort of arcs of these various great awakenings. Like, you had the Reformation happen, but but then there was a lull, and then the first Great Awakening happening, and then there was a lull, and then the second Great Awakening, and then there was a lull, and then the third Great Awakening, and we find ourselves now in a lull, and in North, now I need to say in North America,
Yeah.
because, like, for example, we had, so like I said, I had a Korean pastor who's actually a Presbyterian background, walked into the church and saying, you know, I'm kind of looking for space. We took his name down because as a possible rental in the afternoon of being a presence in the community for an ethnic congregation, particularly of Korean descent. are looking for a home, and we happen to have space and the time slots available for that. So that's another possibility, that Christianity is growing so well in these various places that that missionaries are starting to come here.
I was always going to bring my grandson into Nick, baptize him myself, just like Archie Bunker did to his grandson.
Yeah.
But I didn't do that.
Well, and talk about an ethical conversation that we have with colleagues of grandparents who want their children baptized, but the parents don't. And trying to honor that, but also to try and make sure that, well, like, the grandparents don't actually have that kind of authority. But it is trying to work with that. You know, Marilyn, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, isn't it the idea that no one wants to go to the traditional churches? They all want to go to like community church or something else, and where there's music being played with guitars and stuff like that. They don't want as much a sermon. They want to be able to have more music that kids would enjoy now.
Well,
They want to be entertained.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, is there a factor of that? Maybe, but at the same time, like some of it is, here's an irony. Many of the churches that are more liberal theologically tend to be more conservative in terms of the way in which we worship. And trying to bridge that gap. Now, there are places where it is working. Like, I talked about. Did I talk about weird church last week?
No.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, up in Cumberland. They're a little far away, but they're an example where, you know, they've managed to kind of tune into the local culture and to understand it and to work with it. Another church that in Canada that has done this well is Hillhurst United Church in Canada, which is arguably the fastest growing congregation across the board of any denomination, is a United Church, and it's Hillhurst United Church in Calgary, and that includes children.
That was,
Hillhurst, Calgary.
wasn't it Fred's?
Yes, that was the congregation that Fred was part of, way before. He was there way before.
Yeah.
This revival happened, and what happened is that the minister there, the church itself was just like this close to closing, so they had nothing to lose. And so the ministers actually went into the community and saying, who are the people here? And discovered that the Kensington area of Calgary, despite Calgary's reputation of being a socially conservative city, is that it had a very, there was like the Kensington area was probably one of the most socially progressive places in the city, that there was a fair concentration of gay couples living in, and decided, you know what, we are going to open this up. And then what they decided to do is that they said, instead of waiting for people to come and getting money, they said, we have these endowments, like, you know, even though we're this close to closing, you know, we have these endowments, so we're going to hire someone to do this ministry. And then as that began to take off, then someone said, well, there's also this need over here. Okay, we're going to hire someone else to do this. And then so you have a church with one full-time minister and 20 part-time, each of them with their own minister, each doing their own thing. And then and that includes Hillhurst United Church was actually the innovators that created the United Church's the national church's affirming process. They're the ones who pioneered it. And they also have Indigenous ministries, specifically in Calgary, and have hired an Indigenous minister to work with Indigenous communities within Calgary. But they don't necessarily tie what they do to Sunday morning, but they have found that Sunday morning has started to grow to the point where they actually, if I remember right, they actually have 2 different worship services. And so like you know, are they mega church size? No, but are they large? Yeah, they probably somewhere between 600 and 800 people in worship over the various places where they have it over the course of a given week. Which, Gary, is what you need to know is that is enormous for a Canadian church. Period.
Yeah.
You know, you almost have to take whatever the American numbers are and just divide them by 10 for comparison.
Okay.
And
I was going to say, you know how the schools, they took away the Lord's Prayer. So it was something that, I mean, even if you didn't go to church, you were familiar with things, and maybe you'd go to church with a friend. Well, now that's all gone. They don't even know what the Lord's Prayer is.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the cultural Christianity has kind of has faded. I mean, the only place that I ever remember prayer in schools was the 1 year I lived in Ontario when I was Ian's age, and so that was 1977, 78. I was in grade 4. At least let me do the math there. Yeah, I think it was it's either 77, 78 or 78, 79. Anyway, but it was never the case in Alberta. And I can't say for BC because I never went to elementary school in BC, but I don't recall that being a case. Like Sarah grew up in Vancouver, and that was never the case. But yeah, like elements of the cultural Christianity have long since mustered out of you know that increasing secularization has been part of Canadian culture. And in some respect, you know, is it a bad thing? It's hard to say, because like what would happen is that the culture itself pushed people into churches. Now what we have is we have people who are there who want to be there, as opposed to people who think that they have to. So I mean, that, you know, that's I do see a certain degree of optimism there. But what it also has done is it's also kind of forced us into being a little bit more innovative in what we're doing. Like, for example, I got some good news to share. We have our first dance partner with our upcoming the Rural Connect system.
Oh,
Port McNeill has said yes.
Oh, good.
So this tiny little combined Anglican United Church on the northern tip of Vancouver Island. I've got to get one of those boxes up there somehow with before we get this started. So we're going to be sharing worship with Port McNeill, and if things go well, we'll be sharing it with Campbell River and hopefully Denman Island. Those are the other two that we're waiting on.
You know, off of Port McNeill, on I think at Malcolm Island, there's a reserve there. You might talk to them.
Well, and there may be some opportunities there. Actually, I think I met someone from up there who happens to play a similar game than I do, and I was kind of hoping to reconnect with him at one point. But anyway, that opportunity may come.
Take your kayak.
Yeah. So any other questions? Realizing that, you know, I kind of finished the slides at almost 50 minutes ago. And so this is exactly what I was kind of hoping, that we'd have this conversation.
Yeah, no, it's been
you know,
very good.
Yeah, and to you, Gary, thank you very much for walking with us through this.
No,
And
I feel you've done a great, you really organize this well, and I think I've learned everything I want to know about the United Church of Canada, but was afraid to ask.
well, and thank you. And I mean, like going forward, if you have questions about anything, like because things are slightly different and organized a little bit different. If there's a particular like have I heard about this particular church, or like for example, another denomination that you probably would not have heard of in the United States is the Christian Missionary Alliance, or the short form, the Alliance Church. They're, I think, one of the larger denominations in my hometown of Calgary in terms of a Protestant denomination. And I see Joy nodding her head. They're
yeah, there's the ones with 1,000 people there.
Yeah, and whereas there is one here there's one here in Nanaimo, but it's a fairly, I think they're in a building smaller than we are, but they're near the hospital, for example. And they're kind of they sort of have a Presbyterian style governance, but they're adult baptism, and they lean into what we call kind of a dispensationalist apocalyptic theology.
What does that mean?
Yeah.
In other words, the world's their constants, like the world's gonna end soon, so you got to punch your ticket to get to heaven.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Sort
No,
of.
thank you. Okay.
That is. I mean, that's the real Coles Notes version of it. But yeah, unfortunately, they were Presbyterian at one point, had Reformed theology, but they've leaned very much into the influences from the Plymouth Brethren.
Do you know about St. Andrew's Presbyterian here? I know there's, like back home, there's different types of Presbyterians,
Yeah.
and some are more fundamentalists than others. Where does St. Andrew's fall in? Are they?
They are Presbyterian Church in Canada, but the minister that there is former Pentecostal, and
Okay.
so some of it is dependent upon the leadership.
Sure. Yeah.
When I was doing my internship 26 years ago, St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church actually felt much more United Church at the time, but I think I kind of get the sense, and I mean, I know and respect Jeremy, but given what his theological background and training, I mean, he went to a place called Tyndale College in Toronto, which is not a Presbyterian college. You actually have to, if you go to something other than one of the approved colleges within the Presbyterians, and for that matter, for the United Church, you do have to do time at a seminary that is actually within the denomination. So he had to do some like, he started life as Pentecostal, but felt called more into Presbyterian. Now, that said, given that the Presbyterian Church in Canada has now moved to more socially progressive approaches as a whole. Now, there are some within the Presbyterian Church in Canada who are vehemently opposed to that.
Sure. Yeah.
I can name at least 5 off the top of my head. And so I don't necessarily know where Jeremy falls on that, but I would say, given his experience, they probably lean a little bit more towards the somewhat charismatic.
And they probably still have that Calvinistic predestination for.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, I think it's fair, like not dogmatically so, but there would certainly still be that kind of leaning. The Yeah, I mean, now it also helps that, I mean, Jeremy's a bit younger than I am. He has several kids of his own. So I mean, I bring one, he brings three, sort of thing. And of course, that sort of builds kind of a critical mass. And no, and
Yeah.
you know, it also helps whether it helps or doesn't help. I mean, I am married to the minister at St. Andrew's United Church. So, you know, and in fact, she's actually teaching or had been teaching a Bible study out here while I've been in here. But
Okay, well, I just want to thank you for putting this on, and it's been worthwhile. Thank you.
not a problem.
Mhm.
And again, I know I've said it before. Welcome, welcome to Vancouver Island. Welcome to Canada. And you know, any sort of questions you have, just shoot me an email.
Okay, I'll do that. Thank you.
Not a problem.
Great.
So, and for everybody else, realizing I need to put my son to bed in like 6 minutes, and he is.
Are we still recording?
We are still recording, so I'm just gonna stop the recording now. But again, thank you, and then I'll stop.